The steel corridors of Joint Base Andrews gleamed under the cold fluorescent lights. It was early morning when Luke Tanner pushed his cleaning cart down the hallway near the main conference hall, wearing the blue-gray uniform of facility maintenance. At 36, his face carried lines that spoke of more than just hard work. From the far end came the measured click of polished shoes. Lieutenant General Alexandra Pierce approached with 4 staff officers. Her uniform was immaculate, 3 stars gleaming on her shoulders. Luke stepped back, but his mop caught the bucket's edge. Water sloshed onto the general's black shoes. She stopped. "You think this is a barn, janitor?" Soft laughter rippled behind her. Luke lowered his head. "Sorry, ma'am." He moved back, but the mop handle brushed her pant leg, leaving a wet streak. The laughter grew louder. Alexandra grabbed his collar, pulling him forward. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The fabric gaped open at the neck. There, just visible, was a tattoo. Black and silver. A delta triangle. An eagle with spread wings. The laughter died instantly. Alexandra's grip loosened, her face going pale. Delta Force. But why was it here, on a janitor's chest, beneath her fingers? Luke Tanner's official file read simply, "Civilian contractor, facility maintenance." His work shift ran 12 hours, sometimes more when the base hosted joint operations or when inspection teams arrived from the Pentagon. He arrived before dawn and left after dark. His badge granting him access to non-classified areas only. The barracks housing, the commissary, the public hallways, the grounds. Nothing more. His performance reviews were unremarkable, punctual, thorough, quiet, the kind of employee who became invisible through sheer competence. No one looked twice at the man with the mop. But away from the base, in a small apartment complex 20 minutes outside the gates, Luke Tanner lived a different kind of life. The apartment was modest, 2 bedrooms, with model airplanes hanging from fishing line in the living room. They turned slowly in the air from the ceiling fan, casting small shadows on walls painted a soft cream color. Maya, his 8-year-old daughter, had built most of them herself. Her small hands surprisingly steady with glue and tiny parts. She had her mother's eyes, dark and thoughtful, and her father's quiet determination. She also had chronic asthma, the kind that required expensive medication, regular monitoring, and health insurance that Luke could only maintain through his contractor position with the military. On this particular evening, Luke arrived home at 8:30. Maya was already in her pajamas, her inhaler sitting on the nightstand beside a stack of library books about aviation. She looked up when he entered, her face brightening. "Did you fly today, Dad?" It was her favorite question, asked in different variations almost every night. Luke smiled, the expression softening the hard lines around his mouth. "Only when I needed to save somebody, kiddo." He sat on the edge of her bed, picking up the book she'd been reading. "Tonight, how about we read about the people who keep planes in the air?" She nodded eagerly, scooting over to make room. Later, after Maya fell asleep, Luke stood at his bedroom window, looking out at nothing in particular. Some nights, the dreams came. The sound of helicopter rotors, the percussion of explosions, radio static and voices calling coordinates, fire and smoke, and the weight of another man's life in his arms. On those nights, he would wake gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs, and he would walk quietly to Maya's room just to watch her breathe. The steady rise and fall of her small chest under the blankets, the peace on her sleeping face. It was enough to pull him back from the edge of those memories. Enough to remind him why silence was sometimes the bravest choice a soldier could make. Across the city, in the command housing section of Joint Base Andrews, Lieutenant General Alexandra Pierce sat at her desk long after her staff had gone home. Her quarters were exactly what one would expect from a 3-star general. Everything in perfect order. Awards and commendations arranged by date on one wall. Books on military strategy, organized alphabetically on the shelves. A single photograph on the desk, professional and formal, showing a man in a colonel's uniform, Colonel Nathan Pierce. Dead 9 years now, killed in action during Operation Iron Falcon in 2015. The mission that had changed everything. Alexandra picked up the photograph, running her thumb along the frame's edge. Nathan had been the best parts of her, the pieces that knew how to laugh, how to bend, how to see the world as something other than a battlefield, requiring constant vigilance. After his death, those parts had been buried along with him. What remained was efficiency. Protocol. The Iron General. It was what the media called her. And she wore the name like armor because armor was all she knew how to wear anymore. But tonight, that armor felt thin. She set down Nathan's photograph and opened her secure laptop, accessing the classified personnel database. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Then she typed, Delta Force Team 9. Ghost Hawk. Missing in action. The search results loaded slowly. When they appeared, her breath caught. Sergeant First Class Luke Tanner. Last known action, 2015, Operation Iron Falcon. Mission profile. Convoy protection. Status. Missing. Presumed killed in action. There was a photograph attached to the file, taken years ago. The face was younger, harder, but unmistakable. The janitor, the man whose collar she had grabbed that morning. The man with the Delta tattoo. Alexandra sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Operation Iron Falcon had been Nathan's last mission. She had been there too, a colonel then, commanding a supply convoy that had been ambushed in hostile territory. The attack had been devastating. Her vehicle had taken fire. Nathan's unit had been 3 clicks away, responding to the distress call. But before they arrived, someone else had appeared. A Delta team, operating in the shadows, had broken through enemy lines to create an exit corridor for her convoy. She remembered the radio transmission, garbled with static but clear enough. Go, ma'am. I've got your 6. She had never known who had said it. The after-action report listed several casualties, several missing. Nathan had died trying to reinforce that same corridor. The Delta operators who had saved her had vanished into the chaos of war. And now one of them was here, mopping floors, wearing a janitor's uniform, living in obscurity while she commanded thousands. The afternoon sun filtered through the high windows of the base commissary, creating patterns of light and shadow across the tables. Alexandra had come to grab coffee between meetings. A rare moment of relative normalcy, in a schedule usually measured in 15-minute increments. She noticed the child first, a small girl sitting alone at a corner table, a book open in front of her but her attention focused on the window. The girl coughed softly, then reached for an inhaler sitting beside her backpack. A young medical corpsman approached, speaking gently, helping the child use the device correctly. Alexandra found herself walking over, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. Who is she? The corpsman straightened, surprised to be addressed by a 3-star general. Sir, that's the daughter of one of our facility maintenance contractors, Mr. Tanner, from the East Wing. He sometimes brings her during his shift when school's out. She's quiet, stays in approved areas. Alexandra looked at the child more closely. Maya. That was her name. She remembered it from the personnel file she had accessed the night before. Dependent. One daughter, 8 years old, chronic medical condition requiring ongoing treatment. Luke appeared then, moving quickly through the commissary entrance, his expression tight with worry. When he saw Maya, the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. He crossed to her in a few long strides, kneeling beside her chair. Sorry I'm late, sweetheart. How are you feeling? The girl smiled up at him. I'm okay, Dad. The nice soldier helped me. Luke glanced at the corpsman, nodding his thanks, then became aware of Alexandra's presence. He stood slowly, his posture automatically straightening despite the civilian clothes. Ma'am, Alexandra heard herself speak, her voice colder than she intended. Children are not permitted in operational areas of the base. Luke met her eyes steadily. I'm aware, ma'am, but I can't leave her home alone, and I work in civilian maintenance zones, which are technically public access during business hours. I checked the regulations. There was no challenge in his tone, just simple fact. He turned back to Maya, helping her pack her things, his movements gentle and practiced. Alexandra watched him lift the girl's backpack, watched the way his daughter tucked her small hand into his larger one, and something uncomfortable twisted in her chest. That night, back in her quarters, Alexandra stood at her window looking out at the lights of the base. The image of Luke Tanner kneeling beside his daughter wouldn't leave her mind, nor would the question that had been circling since yesterday morning. If he really was Delta Force, if he really had been part of that ghost team that saved her convoy, why was he here? Why was he pushing a mop instead of commanding operations? Why had he let himself disappear into this civilian anonymity? She thought about the tattoo, the Delta insignia that marked him as one of the most elite soldiers in American military history, and she thought about her own words that morning. "You think this is a barn, janitor?" The shame of it sat heavy in her stomach like lead. The Pentagon inspection team arrived on a cold Thursday morning, 3 officials in dark suits, accompanied by a brigadier general from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Alexandra hosted them in the main briefing room, a space designed to impress with its wall-mounted displays and state-of-the-art presentation technology. Everything had been prepared meticulously, slides loaded and tested, coffee service arranged, security protocols reviewed, but 20 minutes before the briefing was scheduled to begin, disaster struck in the form of a spilled cup of coffee across the keyboard of the primary presentation laptop. The staff officer responsible went pale. Alexandra maintained her composure, but inside, frustration simmered. The backup laptop was retrieved, but the presentation files were encrypted on the damaged machine's solid-state drive. The IT specialist on duty began working on the problem, his movements increasingly frantic as the clock ticked down. Alexandra was preparing to deliver the briefing from memory when Luke Tanner appeared in the doorway, his cleaning cart beside him. He had been working in the adjacent hallway. He took in the scene with a single glance. "May I help, ma'am?" His voice was quiet, deferential. The IT specialist looked up, irritated. "Unless you have a degree in data recovery, I don't think." But Luke had already moved to the table, assessing the situation. "Permission to attempt recovery, General?" Alexandra hesitated only a moment. "Granted." She watched as he pulled a small multi-tool from his work belt, the kind that seemed too sophisticated for a janitor to carry. His movements were swift and certain. He powered down the laptop, removed the back panel, extracted the SSD, and connected it to an external dock he'd pulled from the backup equipment kit. Within minutes, he had the drive mounted, the files transferred to an external drive, and the backup laptop booting with the recovered presentation loaded. A colonel from the inspection team leaned forward. "Where did you learn to do that?" Luke's hands stilled for just a moment. "Somewhere without schools, sir." The room went quiet. It was the kind of answer that meant everything and nothing, the kind that soldiers who'd operated in the deep dark knew how to give. Alexandra watched him close the laptop and step back, his face neutral, his posture unremarkable. But his hands had moved with the kind of efficiency that came from working in situations where seconds mattered, where one mistake could cost lives, where technology was often the only lifeline to survival. "Thank you," Alexandra said, her voice measured. Luke nodded once and left the room, his cleaning cart squeaking slightly as he pulled it back into the hallway. The inspection proceeded flawlessly, but Alexandra barely heard her own words as she delivered the briefing. She kept seeing those hands, quick and competent. She kept hearing that voice, calm and certain. She kept thinking about the kind of training that taught a soldier to fix computers in combat zones, to recover data under fire, to operate in places without schools, where the only education came from necessity and survival. After the inspection team departed, she stood alone in the briefing room, looking at the laptop that Luke had saved. One of her aides knocked softly. "General? You have a call from Northcom in 10 minutes. Alexandra nodded absently. "Thank you. I'll be ready." But for a moment longer, she stood there, and in her mind, she heard a radio transmission from 9 years ago, crackling with static. "Go, ma'am. I've got your 6. She wondered if it had been his voice, if those same hands had cleared the corridor that saved her life. If the man she had humiliated in a hallway had once been the ghost who had given her a second chance at living. The fire alarm shattered the quiet of the late evening shift. its shriek echoing across the fuel depot section of the base. Alexandra had been working in her office when the call came through. A secondary fuel storage building, not the main depot, but still dangerous, had experienced an electrical fire. The base fire team responded within minutes, their trucks screaming across the tarmac. Alexandra drove to the scene herself, as she always did during any significant incident on her watch. When she arrived, smoke was billowing from the building's west side, black and thick against the darkening sky. The fire chief approached her immediately. "We've got it mostly contained, General, but there's a concern about structural integrity in the storage area. We're keeping everyone back." Alexandra nodded, scanning the scene. Most of the facility staff had been evacuated. The firefighters worked with practiced efficiency, their hoses trained on the flames. And then she saw him, Luke Tanner, in his civilian work clothes, standing near the outer cordon with a group of maintenance workers who'd been cleared from the area. He was watching the building with the kind of intensity that made her uneasy. One of the firefighters came running from the building. "Chief, we've got a man trapped in the equipment room. Doors jammed from the heat expansion." The chief swore, calling for his entry team, but Luke was already moving. He broke from the group, running toward the building before anyone could stop him. "Tanner!" Alexandra heard herself shout. But he didn't stop. He grabbed a fire jacket from one of the trucks, pulled it on without breaking stride, and disappeared into the smoke alongside the entry team. Alexandra's heart hammered. "Get him out of there." The fire chief was already on his radio, his voice sharp with command. But Luke had reached the trapped man first. Through the smoke, Alexandra could see shapes moving, could hear the sound of metal being forced, could see the silhouette of someone carrying another person across their shoulders. The entry team emerged, the trapped worker safe between them. And then Luke came out, his borrowed jacket torn and smoking. The blast from a small explosion inside had caught him, throwing him through the doorway. He stumbled, went down on one knee, and the jacket fell open. The fire's light illuminated him clearly. His shirt had been partially burned away. And there, on his chest, was the tattoo. Black and silver. Unmistakable even through the soot and ash. The Delta Triangle. The eagle with spread wings. Every person in the vicinity could see it. Alexandra stood frozen, her mind flooding with memories. Operation Iron Falcon. The ambush. The fire that had consumed Nathan's vehicle. The explosions. The radio voice. "Go, ma'am. I've got your 6. And now here, 9 years later, the same fire, the same smoke, the same selfless courage that ran toward danger instead of away from it. Luke looked up, his eyes meeting Alexandra's across the space. For a moment, everything else fell away. The sirens, the shouting, the smoke, all of it became distant. In his eyes, she saw recognition. He knew that she knew. He knew that the secret he'd kept for years, the identity he'd buried under janitor's uniforms and civilian anonymity, was finally visible. And in her eyes, he saw the questions, the guilt, the realization crashing over her like a wave. They held that gaze for 3 heartbeats. Then Luke stood, shrugged off the ruined jacket, and walked away into the darkness beyond the emergency lights. Alexandra returned to her quarters, but she couldn't sit still. She paced, her mind refusing to rest, refusing to let her hide from what she had seen. Finally, she sat at her desk and accessed the classified personnel system again. But this time she went deeper. She pulled every file related to Operation Iron Falcon, every after-action report, every casualty list, every missing in action presumption. And there, buried in a file marked with the highest security clearance, she found it. Delta Force Team 9. Call sign, Ghost Hawk. Mission objective, high-value target extraction. Secondary action, provide emergency support to Colonel Pierce's convoy. Team lead, Sergeant First Class Luke Tanner. The report detailed what had happened. Ghost Hawk had been operating 3 clicks from her position when her convoy was ambushed. They had broken protocol to respond, knowing that official reinforcements were too far away. Luke Tanner had led his team through enemy fire, creating a corridor for her vehicles to escape. 3 members of his team had been killed in the action. Luke himself had been listed as missing, presumed dead, when his team failed to reach the extraction point. The report noted that his actions had directly saved 17 lives, including that of Colonel Alexandra Pierce, who had gone on to become one of the youngest generals in Air Force history. Alexandra read the words again and again. 17 lives saved, including hers. Nathan had died, trying to reach her from the other direction. But Luke Tanner had already gotten her out. The man she had grabbed by the collar, the man she had mocked, the man whose daughter needed medicine he could barely afford. He had saved her life, lost everything, and ended up mopping the floors she walked on. The weight of it pressed down on her chest until she couldn't breathe. She stood abruptly, grabbed her keys, and drove to the civilian housing complex without allowing herself time to reconsider. His apartment was on the 2nd floor, a modest building with external stairs. Alexandra climbed them slowly, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. She stood outside his door, her hand raised to knock. But she hesitated. Through the thin walls, she could hear his voice, low and gentle, reading aloud. And the hero didn't need a medal, because he already had something better. He had kept his promise. Maya's voice, sleepy and content. Did all heroes keep their promises, Dad? The real ones do, sweetheart. The real ones always do. Alexandra lowered her hand. She stood there in the hallway, listening. As Luke finished the story and tucked his daughter into bed, she heard him move through the small apartment. Heard water running. Heard the soft sounds of a man preparing for another day of invisible work, and she felt tears on her face, the first she had cried since Nathan's funeral. She had built her entire career on the foundation of that day, on the lives that had been saved, on the mission that had cost her everything and given her everything, and she had never known the name of the man who had made it possible. Now she knew. And she had treated him with contempt. Alexandra drove back to the base, but she didn't go to her quarters. She went to her office and began drafting a letter. Not a report. Not an official document. Just a letter. It took her 3 hours to write. And when she finished, she read it through once, then sealed it in an envelope. In the morning, she would find a way to deliver it. In the morning, she would begin the process of making things right. But tonight, she sat alone in her office, and she thought about honor and sacrifice. And the fact that sometimes the most heroic thing a person could do was simply survive and keep going, one key a day at a time. The morning light felt different when Alexandra arrived at the base the next day. She had Luke Tanner's personnel file pulled up on her tablet, along with the letter she had written. She didn't have a specific plan, just a conviction that silence was no longer acceptable. She found him in the East Corridor, near the maintenance supply room, organizing cleaning supplies with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. When he saw her approaching, his posture shifted subtly, preparing for whatever was coming. Sergeant Tanner. The title hung in the air between them, sharp and clear. Luke went very still. I haven't been called that in a long time, ma'am. Alexandra stopped a respectful distance away, close enough to speak quietly but not so close as to crowd him. I owe you an apology. Not just for the other day in the hallway. For not knowing. For not looking past the uniform you wore to see the one you earned. Luke's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A wariness that had been there easing slightly. You don't owe me anything, General. We both lost people in that war. We both did what we had to do. You saved my life. The words came out more abruptly than she intended. Operation Iron Falcon. You were Ghost Hawk. You pulled my convoy out when we were dead in the water. Luke nodded slowly. That was the mission. Your entire team died. 3 of my team died. He corrected gently. I survived. And that convoy made it out. So did you. That's what matters. Alexandra shook her head. You were declared missing, presumed dead. You could have come back. You could have been reinstated. There are protocols for soldiers who... I couldn't come back. His voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath now. My injuries were extensive. Medical discharge was the only option. And after Rachel died, after Maya was diagnosed, I needed to be a father, not a soldier. She needs stability. She needs health coverage. She needs someone who comes home every night, even if that someone is just a janitor. The word janitor carried no bitterness, just simple fact. Alexandra felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. I could help. I could get your rank restored. Your benefits. No. The word was firm but not harsh. Maya needs a father, not a warrior, not a hero. Just someone who's there. They stood in silence for a moment, the cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment around them creating an odd backdrop for a conversation about war and survival. Finally, Alexandra spoke again. I was wrong. About you. About what I said. Luke looked at her directly, and for the first time, she saw something in his face that might have been forgiveness. We're all just trying to get through it, General. You have your way. I have mine. Doesn't make either of us wrong. Just makes us human. He picked up his supply cart, preparing to move on to the next corridor. Alexandra watched him go, this man who had saved her life, and then disappeared into obscurity to save his daughters. She thought about Nathan, about the way war took everything and gave nothing back except ghosts and memories. But Luke Tanner wasn't a ghost. He was here, alive, choosing his battles differently now but still fighting with the same courage. Just quieter. Just in ways that didn't require medals or recognition. Just in the way that mattered most. The package arrived at Luke's apartment 3 days later, delivered through the base medical system with all the proper authorization codes and signatures. Inside was a 3-month supply of Maya's asthma medication, the expensive kind that their insurance only partially covered, along with a prescription renewal form already processed. There was no note, just a routing slip that showed it had been ordered through the command medical office. Luke held the medication in his hands, staring at it for a long moment. Then he sat at his small kitchen table and wrote a response on a piece of notebook paper, his handwriting careful and precise. Thank you, ma'am. He left the note in an interdepartmental mail envelope addressed to the general's office, dropping it in the official mail system before his shift started. He didn't expect a response. And he didn't receive one. But 2 weeks later, he was called into a meeting with Base Human Resources. They informed him that his background check had been flagged for re-review as part of routine security updates. Alexandra had quietly initiated the process, using her authority to ensure it was handled properly. The result was a lateral transfer to the Technical Maintenance Division, a position that came with slightly better pay, better benefits, and the kind of work that actually used the skills he'd been hiding for years. Luke understood what had happened, and he understood what it meant. She was trying to help without overstepping, trying to give him back some of what he'd lost without forcing him into a uniform he no longer wore. He accepted the position. The work was better, more challenging, more suited to someone with his background. And it was still civilian, still stable, still the kind of job that let him be home for Maya's bedtime. Word spread through the base in the quiet way that information always moved through military communities. People started looking at him differently, speaking to him with more respect, though no one said anything directly. And Alexandra, when their paths crossed in the corridors or the commissary, would nod slightly, a small acknowledgement that required no words. One afternoon, Luke and Maya were eating lunch in the outdoor seating area near the commissary, one of the few spaces where families were welcomed. Maya was chattering about a school project, her inhaler sitting on the table beside her sandwich, unused for once in the dry autumn air. Luke listened, nodding and asking questions, his attention entirely on his daughter. He didn't notice Alexandra until she had already walked past, but Maya did. Dad, isn't that the general lady? Luke looked up in time to see Alexandra pause, glance back at them, then continue on her way. But there had been something in her expression, something almost wistful. That evening, alone in her quarters, Alexandra thought about the scene she'd witnessed. The father and daughter, sharing a simple meal, talking and laughing in the afternoon Sunday. It was such an ordinary moment, the kind that happened thousands of times every day on military bases across the world. But it represented something extraordinary. something that Luke Tanner had fought for in a way that had nothing to do with weapons or tactics. He had fought for normalcy, for peace, for the chance to raise his daughter in a world where the worst thing that happened was a school project deadline or a forgotten lunchbox. She had spent years chasing promotions and commands, building a career on the foundation of that day in the desert. But Luke Tanner had built something different, something smaller, something that mattered more. The alarm pierced the night at 0200 hours. Emergency protocols triggering automatically across the base. Alexandra was awake instantly, years of training overriding the need for sleep. She grabbed her uniform and was in the command center within 8 minutes. The situation was evolving rapidly. A sophisticated cyber attack on the base's drone control systems, attempting to gain access to flight operations. The duty officer had already initiated lockdown protocols, but the attack was persistent, probing for weaknesses with alarming intelligence. Status. Alexandra's voice cut through the chaos of the command center. The senior IT officer looked up, his face pale. "We've isolated the affected systems, but they're trying multiple vectors. If they breach the control interface, they could potentially access live drone feeds or, worst case, flight controls." Alexandra felt her blood go cold. Recommendations. We need to shut down all external access and implement Ghost Protocol. But that's not in our standard playbooks anymore. It's old Delta Force doctrine from the mid-2000s. Luke Tanner was in the room. He'd been called in with the rest of the technical maintenance team when the alert went out, his new position giving him access to the command center during emergencies. Alexandra saw him standing near the back, listening intently. Their eyes met across the space. She made a decision. Tanner. Front and center. He moved through the room, and several officers stepped aside to let him pass. He stopped in front of her, his civilian ID badge, looking out of place among all the uniforms. "You're familiar with Ghost Protocol?" It wasn't really a question. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was steady. "I helped develop the field version in 2014. Alexandra turned to the senior IT officer. "Give him emergency authorization. He'll coordinate defensive tactics." The officer hesitated only a moment before nodding. Luke moved to the primary console, but he didn't touch the keyboard. Instead, he began giving instructions, clear and precise, directing the technical team through a series of countermeasures that were both sophisticated and unorthodox. Shut down all external-facing gateways except the primary military network backbone. Isolate the drone control segment completely. Cut the remote access protocols and switch to local control only. Then activate the honeypot protocols on the old system. A captain at one of the consoles looked up, confused. "Honeypot? That's not standard procedure. It's Delta procedure," Luke said quietly. "Make them think they've gotten in, but what they're accessing is a mirror system with no actual control capability. It buys time and lets us trace the attack vector." The team moved quickly, implementing his instructions. Alexandra watched him work, or rather, watched him direct others to work. He never touched a classified system himself, never crossed the line of his civilian authorization. But his knowledge was evident in every tactical decision. 9 minutes after the initial alarm, the attack was contained. 12 minutes after that, the source had been traced and blocked. The command center slowly relaxed, the tension bleeding out of the room. A major from the cybersecurity division approached Luke, his expression a mixture of respect and curiosity. "Only Delta operators know Ghost Protocol. That doctrine was classified above secret." Luke met his gaze calmly. "Then I guess I learned it somewhere above secret, sir." The officer nodded slowly, understanding more than was being said. Alexandra stepped forward. "Good work, Sergeant." She'd used his rank instinctively, and she didn't correct herself. The room had gone quiet, everyone now understanding that the janitor turned maintenance tech was something more. Luke acknowledged her words with a slight nod. "Just doing my job, ma'am." But they both knew it was more than that. It was the same courage, the same competence, the same commitment to protecting others that he'd shown 9 years ago in a desert on the other side of the world. As the command center stood down from emergency status, Alexandra remained, watching the technical team complete their security checks. Luke was packing up the temporary equipment he'd used, preparing to return to whatever project he'd been pulled away from. She walked over to him, keeping her voice low. That was impressive. He glanced up, then back to the cables he was coiling. System security is important. Maya's education fund depends on the base staying operational. It was such a Luke Tanner answer, deflecting recognition by making it about something practical, something personal. Alexandra almost smiled. Still, thank you. He finished coiling the cable and stood, meeting her eyes. You don't have to keep thanking me, General. I'm just glad I could help. And then he was gone, walking out of the command center with his toolkit, becoming invisible again in the way that only Luke Tanner could manage. The media got wind of the incident, as media always did, but the details remained classified. What emerged was a sanitized story about a thwarted cyber attack and the base's effective response. Alexandra refused all interview requests, and her staff managed to keep the operational specifics under wraps. There was no public recognition, no medal ceremony, no official commendation. Instead, 2 weeks later, Luke received a letter on official Joint Base Andrews letterhead. It was a personal commendation, signed by Alexandra, that would remain in his personnel file, but would not be publicized. The letter detailed his actions during the incident, his tactical knowledge, and his continued service to the base community. There was also an attachment, a classified document that only Luke would see. It was a copy of his original Delta Force commendation from Operation Iron Falcon, the one that had been filed away when he was declared missing. Alexandra had retrieved it from the archives, and attached to it was a handwritten note on her personal stationery. Some medals are pinned on uniforms. Others are carried in the choices we make every day. You've earned both kinds. Thank you for showing me the difference. Luke read the note 3 times, then carefully filed it away in a locked box where he kept the few mementos from his past. Rachel's wedding ring, Maya's hospital bracelet from when she was born, his discharge papers, and now this. The following Saturday, Maya had a school event, a small graduation ceremony for students completing an after-school reading program. It was held in the base's community center, one of the spaces where military families gathered for everything from birthdays to memorial services. Luke sat in the back row, as he always did, watching his daughter receive her certificate with pride that made his chest ache. When the ceremony ended, parents and children mingled in the lobby, and Luke was helping Maya pin her certificate ribbon to her jacket when he noticed Alexandra entering through the main doors. She was in civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple blouse, looking younger and less severe without her uniform. She carried a small bouquet of flowers. Maya saw her too. Dad, that's the general lady. Luke tensed slightly, unsure what to expect. But Alexandra approached with a gentle smile, kneeling down to Maya's level. Hi, you must be Maya. I heard you graduated from the reading program. Congratulations. She offered the flowers. Maya looked at her father, who nodded permission, then accepted the bouquet with both hands. Thank you. Are you a general? Like in the Army? Air Force. Alexandra corrected gently. But yes, something like that. Your dad and I work at the same place. Maya's eyes widened. Do you fly jets? I used to. Now I help other people fly them. They talked for a few more minutes, easy conversation about planes and books and what Maya wanted to be when she grew up. Luke stood slightly apart, watching this interaction with an expression somewhere between cautious and grateful. When Maya was distracted by a friend from school, Alexandra stood and turned to Luke. She's wonderful. She is, he agreed simply. Alexandra hesitated, then spoke more quietly. You're saving more people than you know, Luke. Every day. He looked at her, and for the first time since that morning in the hallway, he smiled. A real smile that reached his eyes. No, ma'am. I'm just saving the best part that's left. They stood there for a moment. 2 people who had survived the same war, who carried the same scars, who had chosen different paths but ended up in the same place, watching a little girl laugh with her friends in a safe, bright room. And Alexandra understood, finally, what heroism really looked like. It wasn't always in the fire, and the chaos. Sometimes it was in the quiet, steady presence of someone who showed up every day, who kept promises, who chose love over glory. 1 year later, the change had become permanent, in ways both visible and subtle. Lieutenant General Alexandra Pierce retired from active duty at a private ceremony, attended only by her staff and a few close colleagues. She had served 30 years, and she was done. The official announcement cited her wish to pursue civilian opportunities and spend more time with family. Which wasn't untrue. She'd realized over the past months that the family she wanted to spend time with didn't have to be blood. Sometimes family was built from shared experience and mutual respect, and the quiet understanding that comes from surviving the same darkness. She bought a small house in the Virginia town where Luke and Maya lived, a place with a garden and a porch, where she could sit in the evening and watch the sky change colors. She started consulting work, advising on military logistics and strategy for private contractors, but she kept her schedule flexible. Flexible enough to volunteer at Maya's school. Flexible enough to help Luke with odd projects around his apartment. Flexible enough to be present in a way she'd never been before. On weekends, she taught Maya archery in her backyard, setting up a target and showing the girl how to breathe, how to aim, how to release. They talked about courage and responsibility and what it meant to be strong. And sometimes Luke would join them, standing back with his arms crossed, watching his daughter learn from someone who had become something like an aunt, something like family. One Sunday afternoon in late summer, Luke was outside his apartment building, doing laundry in the shared facilities. He'd hung his shirts on a line to dry in the warm breeze, and one of them had come unbuttoned at the collar. Alexandra was visiting, bringing over groceries she'd picked up on her way, and she noticed the exposed fabric, the tattoo, the Delta Force insignia, faded now with time and sun exposure, but still visible. She set down the grocery bags and pulled at the collar of her own shirt, showing him a scar she rarely revealed, a curved mark near her collarbone where shrapnel had caught her during the ambush. "Same mission," she said quietly. "Different wounds." Luke looked at the scar, then at his own tattoo. "We survived to remember the ones who couldn't." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A shared truth. Alexandra nodded. "And we survived to do more than just remember." In the distance, Maya was playing in the small courtyard, her laughter carrying on the breeze. She was building something with sticks and string, a model airplane or a sculpture, her imagination turning ordinary materials into something special. They both watched her. These two warriors, who had learned that the greatest victory wasn't in the battle but in the life that came after. "She asked me yesterday what a hero was," Luke said, his voice thoughtful. "She said her teacher told them that heroes were brave people who saved others. She asked if I was a hero because I saved people at the base." Alexandra waited, knowing there was more. "I told her that anyone who keeps their promises is a hero. Anyone who shows up when things are hard. Anyone who chooses to help instead of hurt. I told her that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is just be kind." Alexandra felt tears prick her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. "You were right. You are right." Luke turned to look at her. "You're right too. About showing up. About being present." Maya keeps asking when Aunt Alex is coming over next. The title warmed her more than any rank ever had. Aunt Alex. Not General. Not ma'am. Just Alex. A person who had found a second chance at family in the most unlikely place. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The American flag on the distant base hung still in the calm evening air. And here, in this small courtyard in this quiet town, two people who had survived war were learning to thrive in peace. The tattoo that had once symbolized combat now represented something else. Something about the bonds that couldn't be broken by time or circumstance. Something about the courage to be vulnerable, to connect, to care. Maya ran over, her model airplane finished, holding it up proudly. "Look, I made it fly without an engine," she demonstrated, throwing it gently into the air where it glided in a smooth arc before landing on the grass. Alexandra clapped. Luke smiled. And in that moment, everything that had been broken found a way to be whole again. Not perfect, not without scars, but whole in the way that mattered. in the way that let them wake up each morning and choose kindness over bitterness, connection over isolation, love over the ghosts of war. The camera pulls back slowly, the three of them silhouetted against the golden light, and above them, the sky stretches wide and endless, full of possibility.